next speaker will be a little change of the program, Ariaan Baan. Sorry to confront you with that fact. I will introduce you briefly, so take your time. He is currently minister in the Protestant church in Scheemda and Zoutkamp. And I guess that all of you immediately know where that is. That is, both are small villages in Groningen, the province of Groningen, about 65 kilometers away from one another. In 2014, you defended your thesis on the necessity of witness Stanley Hauerwas' contribution to systematic theology. And yesterday, I already mentioned, you could proudly present the translation of Jean Vanier and Hauerwas' book Zalig de zachtmoedigen, het profetisch getuigenis van zwakheid. And now I proudly invite you to address us all, Ariaan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans. How on earth can you both read this Hauerwas and do your work as a village pastor? It was at a seminar for pastors on which I was invited to tell something about my research on Stanley Hauerwas that a colleague of mine asked me this question. I was under the impression that I had just presented an insightful introduction to Hauerwas' theological ethics and expected to have a nice conversation with the audience. But then this question came up, and I didn't have a clue to answer it. To be honest, I was happy to be far away from the congregations I serve, far enough to talk about my research on Hauerwas and not about my work as a village pastor. But then I realized that it was in fact a most crucial question. After all, one of the important lessons I learned from reading Hauerwas is that if we are to be truthful in our theological conversations, we should not abstract our thoughts from our biographies. However, this question confronted me with the way I abstracted my work as a pastor from my research as a PhD student. It was only 1 year ago that I was ordained as a pastor in the Protestant Church of the Netherlands and started to work in 2 small villages in the northern part of the country. I have been so busy in learning to be a village pastor that I didn't take enough time to think about the relation between the theology I love to read and the work I love to do. And what I was unable to do then at that seminar, I will try to do today by answering this uncomfortable question. How on earth can you read Hauerwas and do your work as a village pastor? I think it's not unfair to say that the overtone of my colleague's question was somewhat skeptical. He seemed to think that there were only 2 options. Either my reading of Hauerwas had nothing to do with how I did my work as a village pastor, or my reading of Hauerwas stimulated me to do something which he thought was dangerous, that I was abusing my ministerial authority to transform an amiable Protestant community in some sort of self-sufficient sect. As you might know, this skepticism about Hauerwas' theology is widely shared and clearly formulated, for instance, by Nicholas Healy. I do admit that I have been tempted to read Hauerwas in both ways. Sometimes, after a hard day of work, I read Hauerwas just for fun, just to forget about my work in the congregation. But this temptation of abstracting my reading of Hauerwas from my work of a village pastor is not so difficult to withstand, for even if we read Hauerwas just for fun, we cannot prevent his work from shaping our understandings of ourselves, the world and God. In my case, I cannot prevent that my reading of Hauerwas constantly shapes my vision on the congregation I serve and on the work I do. So I think the real temptation is the other one. As many of you know, Hauerwas argues that Christian communities in late modern capitalistic and liberal society of the West are suffering from forgetfulness. They do not know what it means to be truthful and faithful to the gospel. In short, they do not know what it means to be church. Subsequently, he contends that a transformation of the church in the West is very much required. The true temptation of reading Hauerwas is that we, as his readers, start believing that it's our task to organize this transformation. And the true temptation of reading Hauerwas, for me, is that I think that it's my obligation to remodel the congregation I serve in some sort of Hauerwasian form. Yet, I believe there is also something in Hauerwas' work that helps me to remedy this temptation. But before I delve into this, I need to tell you a bit more about one of the congregations I serve, the Protestant Church of Zuidkamp. The village of Zuidkamp used to be an isolated fisherman's community, and still many people work as a fisherman at sea or in the village big shrimp factory. The local Reformed churches used to play a central role in the village community. However, over the last 30 years, membership of the church has decreased and the congregations are more and more marginalized. I meet many old people in church whose children still live in the village but do not come to church anymore. On a Sunday they see empty seats and realize that the people who were once sitting there will not return. Don't get me wrong, it is really wonderful to work in this congregation. I feel blessed that before I came, the two Reformed churches of the village successfully united. I feel blessed that there is a group of my age who are very much involved into church life. They come to service on Sundays and the children to catechism, and some of them join Bible study groups or become elder. But these people are also worried about our church. They too notice that there are less and less people of their generation coming to church. And they have increasingly trouble to initiate their own children in church life. If I apply Hauerwas' analysis of the West to our congregation in Zuidkamp, I think it fits in many ways. It is true. It is difficult for us to be church in Zuidkamp. The generation before us knew how to be church in their situation, but we find it hard to be church in ours. And I very much agree with Hauerwas that this has something to do with the fact that even in a small fisherman's village, the ideology of late modern capitalist liberalism influences the hearts and the minds of the people. If we believe what politicians and commercials tell us, that we exist to create our very own individual lives, then going to church simply does not make sense anymore. Thus the true temptation of reading Hauerwas as a village pastor is that I apply his vision of the church as some sort of church model. That I think I must initiate a reorganization of the congregation so that it becomes future-proof for the 21st century. However, as I said, I believe there is something in his work that helps me to overcome this temptation. We are not in control. It is this remark that can be frequently found in Hauerwas' work that helps me to withstand this temptation. According to Hauerwas, one of the most obstinate obsessions of modernity is control. Ideologies of control tell us that we have no chance of survival unless, with the aid of the right techniques, we enforce our will on others. On the large scale, organizations like national security services and global operating companies strive after control over the masses, and on a smaller scale, there is another form of control. As autonomous individuals, we strive after control over our own lives. We have become tyrants of our own lives. For Hauerwas, this obsession with control is disastrous because it destroys our ability to have trust. Truthful relationships are only possible if we learn to give up our longing for control. And what about God? Does this claim that we are not in control mean that God is in control? No. In Hauerwas' worldview, this would be an oversimplification to speak about God in this way. The notion of control is not helpful for our thinking about how God works in this world, because control is too much colored by human notions of coercion. Indeed, I think that for Hauerwas, the very idea of God exercising his authority by control destroys our ability to understand who the triune God is and how this God acts in this world. Truthful speech about God is only possible if we learn to give up the conception of control. According to Hauerwas, Christian faith is good news. Good news for us, the people obsessed with control. And the good news is that the God of Israel has given his only Son up to the violent powers of control. Hauerwas has learned from John Howard Yoder that this act of giving up of the powers produces their defeat. The powers of control cannot control this gracious act of giving up. And this defeat is confirmed by the resurrection of the Son from the dead and by his invitation to all people to live in communion with him. It's the Holy Spirit which creates this communion in Christ, in which man finds healing from the destructions of control. Healing so that they can learn to trust God and their neighbor. We are not in control. This remark is extremely important for my work as a pastor. It heals me from the false idea that it's my obligation as a pastor to reform our congregation after some sort of church model. It frees us from the conception of a God who works through control. Indeed, giving up the idea of control creates time and space in which we can re-narrate the story of our congregation. And I believe it to be my ministry to help my congregation in wording this story. What is crucial in this story is that we learn to narrate about the past without sentiments of nostalgia. We must accept that the church form of the past will not return and that this is a good thing. As important is telling about the future without fear. We must learn to accept that we don't know what shape our congregation will have in the future. This way of speaking about past and future creates attentions for the present. It makes it possible to tell about the wonderfulness of our existence. The miracle that we celebrate our Sunday service, that we care for each other, that we tell our children about Jesus, that we are present as a witness to the gospel in the local community. My hope is that my re-narration of the story about our church in Zoutkamp will contribute to the transformation of our congregation. My hope is that we learn that God is in our midst with his healing presence. I've told you about my theological struggle as a village pastor because I think there is a lesson in it for anyone who agrees with Hauerwas that the transformation of the church is very much required. The lesson is, beware of activism. Take care that you do not use Hauerwasian terms like discipline or training or counterculture in an attempt to forcefully overcome the stunning embarrassment that we feel when we think about the future of the church. In that case, your wish for transformation could become an obstacle for God's transforming work. The required transformation can only be acquired if we learn to give up our wish for control. I want to conclude with a quotation from my favorite book written by Hauerwas, Living Gently in a Violent World, written together with Jean Vanier. And actually it's not a quote from Hauerwas himself, but from a pastor who was serving a congregation to which he belonged for a long time. When the congregation came together, this pastor would often look at them and say, "That you are here is a miracle. I couldn't have thought you up or imagined the church. God did." This is what I have learned from reading Hauerwas as a village pastor, that it is our ministry as pastor and theologians to tell this to our congregation. That we are here is a miracle. We couldn't have thought up or imagined the church. God did. Thank you.